Are the data sets, David, where support vector machines are doing particularly poorly? Did you guys talk about this?
There certainly are cases. I'm not sure I know of good examples offhand. I mean, sometimes I use it and I say this isn't working, but I don't have a good example.
NGS data?
This is the breast cancer next generation sequencing data. And so the background was that for clustering yesterday, we found what looked like there were probably 4 clusters, 2 of which we understood, one of which was triple negative breast cancer, one of them was HER2 positive. And then there were 2 subgroups that were both estrogen receptor positive. And they tended to overlap in all the pictures. And so part of what we were looking at here is, could we actually reliably tell them apart? And what I think is the key step in making this an easy classifier is that I used the silhouette width to decide which samples were reliably classified in each of the 2 groups and which ones were ambiguous. And I learned the classifier from the ones that the silhouette width said should be reliably classified. And when you do t-tests between them, I don't know if you were here for, the plot of the histograms from the t-test is still up here. Those robustly classified ones, most of the genes are really different. And that's why this comes out to be an easy classification problem. It says there's huge gene expression differences between them. And that's why you can find classifiers. And part of my argument is that if you do it this way, then those ones that were hard to classify using pure clustering methods, the results of these models should tell you which group they belong in. Because they're doing really well on, when I take these robust ones and split it up and cross-validate, they're still performing really well. Question?
So if you have a data set, so you first you need to do the clustering for this one, or you can directly jump to it?
So that's a good question, right? Should you do the clustering before classification, even if the goal is classification? And I think my answer is that it's not a bad idea to try that. So even if you think you know how many groups there are and know what the true groups are, if you do clustering and compute something like the silhouette width, it does give you realistic information on how easy do I think it is to tell these samples apart. So the potential advantage of doing it that way is that you can build your classifier on the samples that you're sure are in each group. In general, there's always sort of noise in between, ones that are hard to classify, right? Most people's reaction to this isn't to do what I'm doing here. They just try to learn the classifier from all the samples, assuming that all the labels are correct to begin with, right? One of the contexts in which this kind of thing comes up is you're trying to predict good long-term outcome or bad long-term outcome for patients treated with something. And you may try to split this based on some survival, some time to event measure. So that the people who live at least 5 years, you say, have a good outcome. And the people who die within 3 years have a bad outcome. And then there's a whole bunch of ambiguous ones in the middle. And now you can try to put those back in, but it's often the idea that, well, okay, maybe I want to do a binary predictor there, and then use that predictor on the middle to make sure that it's still separating things out in terms of outcome. So we haven't done that part here, because we don't have outcome to look at. It would be an interesting exercise here to apply these methods to the rest of the samples and see how well it separates those samples that were hard to classify before. And it's hard to classify with clustering, because ultimately, right, I mean, the other part of the answer, clustering isn't a classification method, really, right? Because it isn't actually telling you how to make predictions on new samples. And especially clustering that building dendrograms, those dendrograms tend to be very fragile. And that's fragile in the technical sense of the opposite of robust. If you add a couple more samples, in certain cases, you can break the clustering completely. Even old samples that were in different clusters somehow now change. And the way to think about that is that if you have this branch that's split into 2 pieces, and you think about how it got built up, by connecting sort of closest pieces as you go up the tree. If you added samples that were like right on the border between those two groups, then they're going to change what gets linked together, and it's going to shuffle things around. So there's an inherent fragility to that kind of clustering. And so you never want to use clustering. You never want to pretend that clustering is classification, because it doesn't know how to make new predictions and because it's fragile. But it may give you information about which samples are really well classified, and it may allow you to weight those more heavily, because those should have the more characteristic features of the two groups you're trying to separate.
So for this classification, how many groups can predict? Only 2 groups, or if you put more?
So you can do more groups, and there are various ways to do that. It's a harder question when you're trying to predict more than 2 groups. In some cases, you do this by getting a continuous predictor and cutting it. So one example of that is the Oncotype DX test that's trying to predict outcome for, let's see, ER positive, node negative, tamoxifen treated breast cancer patients. Right? That's how it was developed originally. But what they end up doing is dividing people into low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk. The way they do that actually is they build a continuous predictor and draw 2 cutoffs to do that. So that's one of the ways to predict more outcomes if you think they're ordered. The other way to do it is you can build a whole bunch of binary predictors. You can predict either group A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, B versus C, and somehow combine that information. Or you can build binary predictors of 1 against all. We'll predict A versus everybody else, B versus everybody else. Still, at some point, you have to put that together and say, well, what's the highest probability in some sense, and make that as the call. So there's different approaches to that, but they mostly come down to building a bunch of binary predictors and having a rule for combining them at the end.